Okay, good afternoon and welcome back. And I hope everyone enjoyed the workshop at the Letterpress Lab and Digitization, and you've got some energizing trail mix in you now. As we are set to take off on our roundtable for today, Letters, Race, and Empire. So you are in the correct spot and where you be. Today, our roundtable is set up in a slightly modified format. Our speakers have been given only 10 to 15 minutes to present their ideas because we are hoping to curate and develop a robust conversation between our audience members who are here in person, as well as our virtual members. Once again, Riley Fitzpatrick will be moderating the virtual participants, and she will be able to interject their questions and comments for us. So we really appreciate you, Riley. And if you're joining us virtually, please make sure to shoot those questions to her. Our speakers today are Olivera Olivera Jokić, Associate Professor of English and Director of Gender Studies Program at John Jay College in the City University of New York. She's interested in the relationships between literary writing and historical documentation, especially in the archives of colonialism and documentation of marginal experiences, in the Constitution of Archives, and writing about gender and histories of women's writing. Recently, she has co-edited 2 journals' special issues about archives and popular culture. She's also the translator into English of Past: An Introduction to the Problem. Sorry. Jokić will discuss letters and the promise of documenting empire for us. After her, Rebecca Schneider, who's an assistant professor of English at New Mexico Highlands University, will join us, and she specializes in 18th and 19th century colonial Caribbean, as well as literary fieldwork and archival research. She's the founding member of the Bigger Six Collective, which is formed to challenge structural racism and the academic studies of Romanticism. She has prepared Caribbean correspondence, methods for reading, overseer, abolitionist, and missionary letters from the British West Indies for us today. And our last presenter for this roundtable will be Jennifer Hargrave, who is assistant professor here at Baylor University. She focuses on Romanticism and its global entanglement, specifically Anglo-Chinese relations prior to the First Opium War. Her current book project, The Romantic Reinvention of Imperial China, 1759 to 1842, recovers a history of intellectual challenges between the British and Chinese empires. She will tell us more about submersive mobility, epistolary novels, reverse ethnography, and the British Empire. Apologies for my over my tongue. And so thank you so much for joining us. And Olivera, would you please get us started?
Hello, everyone. I don't have a PowerPoint, so you'll have to listen to me the whole time. And thank you to everyone who showed up for us, and thanks to everyone who organized this thing. It's kind of amazing and rare. And it's a special delight to be on the panel or roundtable about letters, race, and empire, also known as the panel of fantastic scarves. And I feel that it's especially great that the roundtable gathers scholars who look at a vast expanse of geographies and from this spot of time and this place. If nothing else, this configuration makes it easier to see or remember that against the map of the entire globe, we're here to speak about and from the afterlives of only one modern empire, the Anglophone one, and to speak in its dominant language. In the context of this historiography, we are here in a kind of afterlife of a whole history of conversations about letters and empire. And we're talking about letters as a form we know we should expect to find in the documentation of modern imperialism. From my perspective, and I will say a little bit more later about my specific views here, letters are an especially interesting lens with which to work out histories of race and empire in the Anglophone world. This empire is the machine that has given us the materials we now use to think about race and other categories of difference in which we live to this day. When we want to look at the documentation of this empire, to set our own place in writing histories of empire here and everywhere, we're often talking about the ways to understand the preservation, the content, and the reading of letters. This assumption is not always made explicit by historians or others who write about the relationship of this empire to writing. When we look at the relationship between letters and empire now, we can only do it in the aftermath of the pressure put on our epistemological frameworks by so-called post-colonial theory. This was a deep transformation of the possibilities of reading and our relationship to empire and its histories, and for that reason, a deep transformation of our relationship to the possibility of documenting that history. This pressure has to be seen in the same frame with the emergence of social and cultural history and history of society as forms of historiography that could legitimately replace diplomatic or political history as dominant forms of historical interpretation. So histories of states, histories of kings and presidents, towards histories of people that have rarely been seen in accounts of the past. This transformation had a profoundly corrosive effect on historical narratives framed by the volatile boundaries of old and new nation states, prompting new questions about the kinds of documentation from which this new historiography could be written. These changes swept through English departments in the United States once Edward Said's Orientalism set a wildfire to the profession and its canonical reading lists. Said's argument about the broad sweep of colonialist representation in Western literary canons undermined the authority of literary interpretations that wanted to imagine Europe and European high culture away from its relationship to structures of cultural and political domination. These discomforts around how far narratives of national and cultural triumph, enlightenment, and progress could ever be from their own underbelly give shape to our attention to letters as a form of historical documentation of empire. The dismantling of dominant narratives of imperial triumph elicited battles of control over the archive. That is, for figuring out what would constitute some plausible archives of empire. What kinds of writing, if writing is the only sort of historical evidence permitted, that we could use to compose a different historical narrative. The intervention of so-called subaltern historians of South Asia in the archival turn of the late 20th century gave a serious spin to the possibilities of historiography of the British Empire. With great disregard for how the empire wanted to think of itself, they set out to read colonial documentation against the grain. That's the phrase from one of the first subaltern historians, to find in it the record of constant challenge to imperial hubris. We could say that this British Empire was an empire of letters. This can be true because they were reading collections of elaborate documentation compiled by the East India Company, the corporate outfit that was chartered by the state to conduct trade in the East Indies. Their mandate was overtaken by the Crown in the mid-19th century, and corporate documentation became state documentation, arranged and rearranged multiple times in order to meet the needs of public political representation of commercial and military activity overseas. The East India Company was an organization notoriously obsessed with writing things down, collecting reports from the emergent empire, shipping them to England, having them read and synthesized, making decisions about policy and action on the basis of such reports. Reports from the ground, written for people who were unlikely ever to see the domains they were controlling with their own eyes, usually took the form of letters. The structure of this archive is reflective of a social structure of the company, and this is in part what I have been interested in. I've been interested in actual networks of people who knew each other and worked in the same offices, so-called factories and forts in South Asia, and reported, especially over the latter parts of the 18th century, about whatever their work required them to do. And this job description varied widely. The ordinary clerks of the East India Companies were called writers. Quite literally, that was the job description. Their job was to keep records and conduct correspondence. The expectation about what was worth recording changed over time, but there was great trust in writing as a good instrument of government. John Stuart Mill, who, when he wasn't thinking about liberty, was having a day job for the East India Company, worked for the company in the early 19th century, and said this about the causes, this is a quote, to which you attribute the satisfactory working of the government. So this is Mill. I conceive that there are several causes. Probably the most important is that the whole government of India is carried on in writing. All the orders given, and all the acts of the executive officers are reported in writing, and the whole of the original correspondence is sent to the home government so that there's no single act done in India, the whole of the reasons for which are not placed on record. This appears to me a greater security for the good government that exists in most any other government in the world, because no other probably has a system of recordation so complete. End of quote. This kind of faith in writing as a transparent instrument of recordation and control is the source of temptation to read all letters as evidence of experience, to read them as if they were transparent, and to desire that effect on us as interpreters of those texts. This is a dynamic similar to that which made epistolary novels legible and popular. The sense that we are on the right side of reading someone else's letters, that we're given documentation of a project we should know how to understand, even if we were not privy to it from the beginning, or we were not aware of the conditions that prompted the writing in the first place. Letters of Empire are in many ways like the letters of early epistolary novels, ostensibly authored by young working class women who were working out of sight of the world that clearly wanted to know a lot about what they were making of their employment, that was their life in general. And historian Carolyn Steedman, my favorite historian, writes about the popularity of Pamela in these terms, that the novel was popular because it was looking like it was providing information about the lives of young working class women who, contrary to sort of conventional imagination of the working class history of England in the 18th century, were not factory workers, but were working in domestic service. The largest sort of section of the working populations of England in the late 18th century were women working in domestic service. This she knows because she has read all the tax returns of people who were living at that time. And other things amazing like that. So letters of empire are documentation of curiosity and control over an out of sight world from which we get letters from people we couldn't know, who were far away in regions we didn't realize would interest us, doing things we didn't know the purpose of. Letters about the British Empire in the 18th century are now about some strange place we can't easily recognize. It might be a burgeoning empire in the case of South Asia, the emergent spaces of control and domination. There are often reports of contact and stories about interaction and interest in cultures and governments on the ground. They're often said they're observing the customs and habits and governments. That's kind of the terminology. Late 18th century writers of letters to London about activities of the East India Company didn't know about the fallout of the empire. This is how, from the perspective of, for instance, 1776, they couldn't imagine that Waco, Texas is in this nation state. This was not a nation state at the time. This was British Empire. The same thing with the status of South Asia. They were going there to kind of meet and greet the local kings and princes. There were like an entire world of local politics, usually pitting the Hindu rulers against the Muslim kings, and a whole world. Is kind of amazing and fascinating, and we don't know anything about it from the Anglophone world of education. For us, the reading of letters can be a trippy experience for that reason. We don't know any of these people, even if they were kings once. We have no idea what they thought they were doing, have no way of anticipating what people who knew each other from work wrote home, and what they were expected to say on behalf of the office located thousands of miles away. On the whole, this is the archive that has been combed over and over again to reclassify and cull documentation in ways that would streamline reading and signal conformity with the rules of realism practiced by the East India Company and with the plot lines of imperial history. But there are also segments of this archive, when you look closer, that archivists describe as the refuse heap of the main body of writing. One such corner is called the Home Miscellaneous series. It's a document series created after the fact, arranged in the 19th century from 18th century documents concerning events and actors whose names we would now find only in modern historiographies written in South Asia or with South Asian audiences in mind, not in historical accounts of Britain. The letters in this series fall outside the prescribed genres of documentation. Sometimes there are networks of correspondence initiated by requests from London for letters that would be, and this is a quote, evidence of experience of how well things were going for various company outposts. There are many letters in this kind of web, but most of them say the office directors cannot get anyone to write because they don't know how their evidence will be read or that anyone wants to record their actual experience for public reading. And if you think about what you know about histories of sort of political scandal in Britain of the late 18th century, the greatest political scandals have to do with people who serve in the East India Company and come back with money, buy themselves parliament posts. Warren Hastings is impeached at the behest of Edmund Burke, who gives months of speeches, and he's not indicted in the end. But it's basically a huge amount of ambivalence about what's okay and what's not okay, and ambivalence about having an empire or doing criminal things that are criminal in England, but when you're out of sight, nobody knows what you're doing. So sometimes they compete, these writers, to send their letters faster or with commentary about how realistic representation should be read. For instance, they argue about the existence of a woman who was described in one earlier report. The later writer argues that the event described never could happen and that any reader could tell that the woman could never have existed because her life and the disappearance were described, quote, with the most studied attention. And he provides a whole sort of revision of that account. This, by the way, this is kind of the thread that I pulled for years. What they're doing is competing. One faction of British officers has deposed the legal faction because they think they are doing better business. And they're trying to scandalize people in England, but it takes 9 months for a letter to arrive. So by the time they are scandalized, things have already happened. And all of the people who were deposing the legal government were in the end recalled back to England, but they came back with so much money that they basically just bought themselves spots in the parliament, and that was the end of it. Huge stuff kind of roiling in the back. So what can we know about these letters as documentation of empire? And in what sense, if the documentation of empire is a function of sociality of such records, their relationship to their writers, but also to us as human readers who think about occasions to write anything in the form of the letter? Because letters are quintessential documentation of sociality, an ethical space, and one to which we bring assumptions about knowing how to read, and in that sense, part of a continuum of writing forms, languages, and materialities that we navigate. In that sense, they are a reflection of what Charles Bazerman calls the sociality of texts. Bazerman argues that letters form the social foundation of various genres of modes and address, from private letter to the letter to shareholders, to arrest warrants, to presidential addresses. Everything in this world of expanding literate audiences is ultimately like a letter. So we can use the idea of epistolarity, I would say, the uncertainty of reading and indeterminacy of communication by the letter as a good name for the strangeness of intimacy promised by the letters of empire. Epistolarity then can be a good name for the way we approach the letters we received from empires. We pay attention to the specifics of the writing situation, and that's a way to pay attention to the colonial situation and its many forms. The British Empire took many forms in different places over the centuries. It has exerted its power. And that's why this is an awesome panel. 18th century Boston was very different from 18th century Bombay or Barbados. And writing a history of empire in such strange letters is a way not to forget our own writing situation and to remember to measure our own distance from the empire. Thank you.
Well, I'm really grateful to be included on this panel, and I've already learned so much at this conference or the symposium today. And so, yeah, so many thanks to the organizers, your vision, how you pulled it all together, all the material needs that you've attended to. It's been really wonderful so far. So I am a scholar of British literature of the long 18th, tending towards long 19th and Romanticism varieties. But almost from the beginning, I focused on the Anglophone colonial Caribbean, AKA the British West Indies. And, you know, West Indies, like sometimes I think that colonial Caribbean is the more appropriately recent term, but West Indies is still widely used. So for example, there's the University of the West Indies, which is still in operation. Like they have an archive that I've spent time at. So I just had that reflection as I was thinking about my title today. So almost from the beginning, I focused on the Anglophone colonial Caribbean, AKA the British West Indies. And I think I'm drawn to, I think the reason why is I'm drawn to those weak points of empire. As demonstrated through slave revolt, countless other forms of resistance, including resistance by indigenous peoples. And archival records have allowed me to get closer to sites of both imperial power that we've heard Olivera talk about a little bit, but also the insecurity of that imperial power. Than what I can see in literary works alone. I worked extensively with archival materials depicting violence against people of color, including in correspondence, and I don't always see a clear methodological way forward in writing about teaching those kinds of materials. So rather than offering prescriptive advice, I want to use my time today to tell some stories of records that have presented methodological challenges for me in research and teaching, and I want to be provocative instead of prescriptive. Let me see if I know how to do this. You thought it was intuitive. Do I have to point it somewhere?
Shouldn't have to.
Help me. Can I use the arrows?
Yes, you can.
Okay,
Think
that's what I'm more used to.
Oh, you can.
I have slides, I
That's
promise I
fine.
do.
Okay, give me one.
I think you're in Zoom, not in PowerPoint.
Yes, okay.
Oh, it advanced, okay.
It did,
advance.
I scrolled with the
Oh, you
mouse.
did, okay, so I'll scroll with the mouse then. Okay. So first, let me rehearse some things that maybe I don't need to rehearse for this crowd, but the limits of archives and archival records, especially critiques coming as they do from Black feminist theory, post-colonial studies, and archival studies. And I'm thinking here of Saidiya Hartman, Hortense Spillers, Gayatri Spivak, Simon Gikandi, in archival studies side of things, Michelle Caswell, Terry Cook, just to name a few. So to rehearse that, archives are political. Institutional archives are made up of records, spaces, and practices that exist within colonial and capitalist contexts. Bearing witness to catastrophe and violence in the records does not bring back the dead, and reading and writing about records risks reproducing their harm. That said, I think archival records do offer further layers of a story that in turn gets told in our own colonial, capitalist, and white supremacist contexts. So all that to say, nothing's neutral. Okay, there we go. It's doing what I needed to do, so thank you. In archival records, we can see the otherwise undocumented evidence of an object moving through the world. I don't know if you probably can't see it, but these are fingerprints. Check out these fingerprints on a 300+ page manuscript held at the National Library of Jamaica that I'm absolutely obsessed with. Various conference presentations later, I still haven't figured out yet how to publish on it. Maybe this will be the year. This is from the same, wrong way. This is from the same manuscript. I love sharing things like this with students who unsurprisingly complain about reading cursive, although almost all eventually rise to the challenge when I give items like this, and I have assigned items from this manuscript in class before. Here are some of those further layers of the story at work. All right, Overseer, part 1 of 3. One of the most well-known examples of a British overseer's archival record is Thomas Thistlewood's journal, preserved in 37 separate bound manuscripts. And for a visual, that's more than what can fit on one of those rolly carts, like a lot more. So don't request all 37 of them when you go to the Beinecke. They're also digitized. Thistlewood lived in Jamaica from 1750 to 1786. His journals are notorious for their prolific documentation of the violence he enacted upon the enslaved people under his power. And he's referred to as a serial rapist based on evidence from these journals. The Beinecke at Yale, as I said, holds the originals, which have been digitized, and the University of the West Indies in Kingston holds a facsimile copy, and so you can see the left and right. These are my photos of the items from both of those archives. I've handled both records. I've never assigned Thistlewood in class, and I sometimes write him into drafts, and I almost always edit him out as I'm getting closer to what I think I actually want to say. So there's something in method there for me that maybe I don't even know. I bring up Thistlewood to note that he sometimes overdetermines how I approach correspondence produced by other enslavers. I want to point out that the known identity of the person who created the record can draw scorn, and that might be well justified. As I tell my students when we work with archival materials in class, it's sometimes necessary to walk away from something. Just because it's preserved in an archive doesn't make it inherently valuable. When I have relied on overseer or enslaver records in my own work, it's usually to demonstrate how they understood their power to be tenuous in the face of revolt that they believed to be imminent. And that's not an exoneration, but I also wonder about the usefulness of disapprobation or scorn. Like, how is that performative to a certain extent? And that's a whole lot that I just dumped on you in that last paragraph, so maybe we can return to some of it in discussion. But here's part of an overseer's letter that I've transcribed held at the National Library of Jamaica. It's written by S.L. Simmons to his sister and describes his first impressions of Jamaica and his new life on Fort Stewart Estate in St. Mary Parish. That's kind of in the northeast. Simmons says that the enslaved people on the estate cajole him to grant them more provisions. They tell him that his recent arrival from England means he doesn't yet know what, quote, they can do for him. Curiously, he doesn't mention the deadliest slave revolt in Jamaica's history that occurred in his new parish within weeks of his arrival, either in late 1831 or early 1832. From his letters that are preserved, it's not clear when he actually arrived, but this is like early 1832 and he's like new still. The entire island was under martial law, so it's difficult to believe that he knew nothing of the revolt unless its absence in this letter was calculated to shield his sister from concern. And not only does he omit revolt, Simmons writes there's this extended section about butterflies, and I'll quote you a little bit. The butterflies, my dear sister, are certainly beautiful here, but I know of no way of catching them, and even if I did, I have so little time to myself that I can't even find time to write in my journal sometimes. And that's the end of that quote. Well, Simmons is seemingly a far cry from Thistlewood. My point in contrasting them is that a seemingly kind enslaver who likes butterflies is still an enslaver. The Christian founder of the oldest university in Texas, who was an enslaver, is still an enslaver, even though we have this amazing institution today. Like to credit to that person's memory. Who could I be talking about? Just like it takes time, and maybe this is the closest I get to an argument in this piece, but just as it takes time sitting with an individual's manuscript to acclimate one's eyes to their unique hand, it can take time to attune one's eyes to an enslaver's rhetorical self-fashioning within the colonial matrix of power and terror that they absolutely are in, to begin to understand the ways in which they personally are attempting to uphold, consolidate, and deploy that power in their own unique ways. And I feel like it's almost as unique as an individual's handwriting. All right, Act 2, Abolitionists. British abolitionist correspondence is quite widely available outside of the archives, such as the letters of Ignatius Sancho, Robert Wedderburn's letters to the editors of Bell's Life in London, Phyllis Wheatley Peters' letters, Liverpool abolitionist Edward Rushton's letter to George Washington. It was returned unopened. It's quite worth your time. But none of these are written from the Caribbean, and even abolitionists with extensive experience in the Caribbean, including Olado Aquilano, Mary Prince, James Ramsey, they are publishing in London. Some works of fiction invent abolitionist correspondence written from the Caribbean, including The Woman of Color, and more so William Earle's Obi, The History of Three Finger Jack. It's an epistolary novel in which the character George Stanford writes from Jamaica to his friend Charles in England, sharing a sentimental account of the enslaved folk hero, Three Finger Jack Manson. He says things like, when you get this letter, you'll see the ink has smudged because I've cried. Like there's been a river of my tears on this page. And so that's why if you can't read it, I've smudged the ink with my tears. Fictional abolitionist correspondence uses the epistolary form to offer a window into the observer's emotional state to then teach the geographically absent reader appropriate reactions to enslaved suffering. In general, correspondence can imply the recipient's distance from the immediate scene. If we're in the same room together, do I have to send you a letter? And I think this is part of the logic, claiming firsthand experience that readers lack in the naming practices of these pamphlets. So these are not letters, these are pamphlets, but they're named letters. These are all from the Beinecke, these are my photos. from left to right, a letter to the treasurer of the society instituted for the purpose of effecting the abolition of the slave trade, letters on the slave trade, supplement to Mr. Cooper's letters on the slave trade, and that's just like a very, very small fraction of similarly named. So again, like the geographic and also like lack of firsthand experience that's implied by the person writing the letter. Like, I was there, I need to send this thing to you, you weren't there. In the 1790s, the notes to the proceedings of the Governor and Assembly of Jamaica, this is a manuscript record that I read at the National Archive, I think in Spanish Town, Jamaica. The 1790s notes reported the government's conviction at the time that a pamphlet titled "A Letter to Granville Sharp, Esquire, from the Reverend Percival Stockdale," was being distributed to urge enslaved people to, quote, "rise into rebellion and murder their masters," end quote. A digitized copy can be viewed on the Library of Congress website, or at least it was on Tuesday. I'm like nervous now of these like government sites. And here's a really short quote from that pamphlet that's titled "Letter." Make sure I have my right page I'm turning to. Yes, okay. Here's the quote. "Should we not approve their conduct in their violence? Should we not crown it with eulogium if they exterminate their tyrants with fire and sword?" End quote. British abolitionist correspondence, whether fictional, in pamphlet form, or whatever, gets credited with enslaved and indigenous agitation and success. And one challenge in telling the story of abolition through archival correspondence is confronting a textual archive that disproportionately represents the thoughts and actions of white actors, but also metropolitan actors, right? Like I was saying, like published from London. All right, Act 3, Missionaries. This is not my photograph. This is from a Methodist website, and it's only tangentially related, but I wanted a photo for you to look at. My final section relates to missionary correspondence about enslaved and indigenous populations. This is a body of writing that is not free from racist assumptions, but also Moravian, Baptist, Methodist, and even Anglican missionary correspondence reveals people who regularly saw themselves as persecuted within the plantation society. For example, the 1831-1832 rebellion that S.L. Simmons omits in his letters was thought by enslavers to have been started by missionaries. In a manuscript letter held at the Jamaica National Library sent from a Mr. Mackenzie on January 14, 1832 to a Mr. Alston in Port Morant, which is on the southeast coast, Mackenzie states that rebellion is, quote, "clearly traced to the Moravian and Baptist missionaries." A month later, Mackenzie writes again to Alston to refer him to the public papers, quote, "For all the details of the sad and painful insurrection, there can be no doubt of its having been a general plot throughout the island, and that the missionaries, one and all, have been concerned in it." British missionary correspondence from Jamaica in the early months of 1832 reveals a sense of urgency to clear their own names rather than intervene in the planter government's bloody quashing of the slave rebellion. In a letter held at the National Library of Jamaica, the Reverend Peter Samuel describes to another Methodist missionary what it was like for him arriving in Jamaica, and he gets there on January 4th, 1832 amidst martial law. So he like steps off the boat. Within 9 days of arriving, this missionary, somebody named Brother Box, which is a name you don't forget. I've seen him in the archive like into the 1830s. And a couple others, they go to the mayor of Kingston to show what Samuels calls their credentials and to complain of, quote, "the enemies of righteousness whose hearts thirst for the blood of all who fear the word of God." That's the enslavers that they're applying that to. Historians tend to agree that the rebellion was masterminded by enslaved organizers, not white missionaries, intended as a general labor strike after the 1831 Christmas holiday to advocate for emancipation, which was passed by Parliament about a year after, likely expedited by this rebellion. An enslaved Black Baptist minister, and I didn't really have room for it in the talk, but I can disentangle the difference between the Black Baptist and the British Baptist missionaries, if anyone's interested. But an enslaved Black Baptist minister called Samuel Sharp in the records, although that may not have been his name, is credited with planning the strike, which then erupted into fighting and conflagration. Sharp was by all accounts literate and read newspaper reports of the abolition bill's progress through Parliament. Archival records of Sharp's court testimonies exist, but apparently no records exist in his own hand. And as you can see now, the Jamaica reissued their paper currency. And so he got upgraded to the $500 bill, which is about I get to remember, I think it's like, oh man, no, the math is escaping me. Also like, I think the US dollar fluctuates daily. That's my excuse. I can't tell you what it is today. I don't know. I haven't looked. All right. This is my concluding paragraph. Some of the methodological challenges when pursuing topics relating to people of color in 18th and 19th century Caribbean archival correspondence are similar to methodological challenges when working on any subject. Limits on time, access to materials, but additional challenges include the scarcity of records produced by people of color and the historical practices of archival valuation that overdetermined white voices and views dominating colonial archives. I talked earlier about being able to tell further layers of a story through archival records. Some layers of the story, such as Hamilton Hughes's life before and after this runaway ad, are irretrievably lost. And there is no neutral record, but neither is scholarly use neutral. Like, I'm not neutral when I use these materials, when I look at these records. Where I think that leaves me with, is with a methodological practice that must, whatever else it is, must also always include self-reflection upon my own desires in the face of what records can and can't do. I'll let you mess with this. Does that sound good? Okay.
Okay.
And I similarly am also just reading, so no slides up here. So for my contribution to our roundtable, I want to home in on the possible intersections between imperial letter books, epistolary novels, and British colonial archiving practices. To get here, I want to start where most my research generally starts, in China. In 1792, a British embassy led by Lord George Macartney departed on a 2-year voyage with the primary purpose of establishing positive diplomatic relations between England and China. My focus today is not the embassy per se, but rather its copious written documentation and the forms that documentation took. These documents generally fall into 3 categories: travelogues, journals, and letter books, with this final category being most germane to our conversations today. I want to trace briefly, though, the different narratives that these texts develop around the first British embassy to China, namely the perception of the Chinese Empire vis-a-vis the British Empire. The most public-facing texts were the accounts published by the various embassy members, from the minister plenipotentiary George Staunton to the embassy's comptroller John Barrow to the ambassador's valet Aeneas Anderson. In short, everyone who participated in the embassy suddenly became a published writer. This flurry of published travelogues reflected public demand for knowledge of the historically sequestered Qing Empire. While the travelogue as a general category does accurately describe these publications, in fact, these texts vary drastically in both tone and content. George Staunton's lavish 3-volume, an authentic account of an embassy from the King of Great Britain to the Emperor of China, which is the abbreviated title, served as the official public narrative of the embassy, and as such assumed a seemingly objective voice and a generally ethnographic focus. The accompanying folio volume contains 49 plates, including maps and detailed lithographs of Chinese people and landscapes. Conversely, John Barrow's economical 1-volume Travels in China, interspersed with only 8 engravings, garnered a much broader readership, made evident in the numerous laudatory reviews found in periodicals and magazines. However, Barrow's text assumes a decidedly imperialist stance towards China, largely missing from Staunton's account, though not completely missing, just primarily. Most notably, Barrow hopes that his narrative will, quote, prove to the world that the late embassy, by showing the character and dignity of the British nation in a new and splendid light to a court and people in great measure ignorant of them before, however misrepresented by the jealousy and envy of rivals or impeded by the counteraction of enemies, has laid an excellent foundation for great future advantages. Barrow falsely concludes that through the embassy, British superiority has been demonstrated and will accordingly afford Britain greater economic advantage in China. Though largely a fiction, it is Barrow's narrative of the first British embassy that dominates accounts of Anglo-Sino relations prior to the First Opium War. And just to demonstrate how widely read Barrow's account is, or any of these accounts, in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, Edmund Bertram happens upon Fanny Price. She is reading the account that is written by Staunton. There are certain details about it that make it clear it's probably Staunton's account. Large passages of Barrow's travels in China appear in Dorothy and William Wordsworth's Commonplace book and are alluded to in the 1805 Prelude. Despite the marked difference between these two travelogues, their source material was largely the same: personal journals and sketchbooks. Prior to the embassy's departure, Macartney instructed all members to keep detailed journals to be shared with Staunton to create an official account. Though many embassy members sought to self-publish, many complied with the ambassador's request, including Macartney himself. In fact, Barrow transcribes upwards of 25 pages from Macartney's personal journal into his travels in China. Although Macartney does reflect on his negotiations with Chinese officials, his commentary does not delve into the intricacies of inter-imperial diplomacy. Instead, he tends toward cultural observations that may easily be edited for inclusion within a travelogue. For example, Macartney includes one anecdote that he, quote, thought would not be fair to leave out of his journal, and so I thought I should not omit from my talk. He records an extract from a Chinese newspaper that Macartney reflects, quote, seems to be much on par with our own newspapers for wit and authenticity. The newspaper itemizes the English gifts presented to the emperor, including, quote, several little men not 12 inches high, but in form and intellect as perfect as grenadiers, an elephant not larger than a cat, and a horse the size of a mouse. This list of presents, seemingly sourced from Lilliput, makes Macartney laugh, but could easily be reframed to reflect upon Chinese intelligence, rather than Macartney's actual commentary on newspapers in England and in China and their tendency to hyperbolize. While Macartney's journal does, in other respects, serve as a valuable record of the embassy, it seems curious that his copious letters, especially those establishing the embassy's remit with Home Secretary Henry Dundas, bear little to no impact on the published travelogues. The journals privilege anecdotal narratives of China, providing little of the experiential evidence that would be thought valuable to a travelogue aimed at educating. Even the first editor of Macartney's China journal, J.L. Cranmer Bing, acknowledges that, quote, on the whole, Macartney's method is businesslike and straightforward, less diffuse than in his letters and dispatches. Why then rely upon Macartney's Spartan journal rather than his letters? As a lifelong civil servant, Macartney maintained comprehensive letter books, making his correspondence relatively accessible. But restricted accessibility is precisely what I believe forced Staunton and Barrow to rely upon journals rather than letters. As Olivera Jokić describes it, the letter book, and this is a quote, the letter book is a fascinating document of the presumed affinities between the writing of colonial history and the writing of letters as two genres that depended on one another for capturing the evidence of experience in the colony and conveying it to Britain, end quote. As such, these letter books constitute the bedrock of Britain's imperial aspirations and colonial governance. These letter books constitute the foundation of the East India Company archives. Yet the imperial network found within Macartney's 1792 to 1794 letter books, though revelatory in revealing Britain's imperial machinations, also exposes great variance in opinion amongst high-ranking government and East India Company officials. In the months leading up to the embassy's departure, Macartney's letters reveal his explicit rejection of Dundas's assumption of British superiority. Macartney frames the embassy as satisfying the monarch's desire, quote, of sending an embassy to the most civilized as well as most ancient populous nation on the globe in order to observe its celebrated institutions and to communicate and to receive the benefit which must result from an unreserved and friendly intercourse between that country and his own, end quote. But even more surprising is Macartney's desire that Britain desist in its exportation of opium from Bengal to China. And so this is way preceding the Opium Wars. This is in the 1790s. So first Opium War starts 1839. Quote, with respect to commerce, opium, which is contraband in China, forms one of the principal articles, and it were to be wished we could substitute rice or any other better production in its place. Macartney's letter books do provide highly informative descriptions of late 18th century China, but they simultaneously direct attention inward, revealing the sausage-making process of empire. And so the letter books are archived, preserved for their valuable information, but sequestered from the public eye. But what I find even more interesting and what actually constitutes the research that I'm currently conducting is the degree to which these archived and effectively concealed letter books inform the publication of epistolary novels cum reverse ethnographies published in the latter half of the 18th century. I'm referring to fictional epistolary texts, usually single-authored from a foreign national traveling within England. This writer usually writes to a single addressee residing outside Europe, yet usually within Britain's imperial, not necessarily colonial, but imperial purview. The writer's letters constitute a blend of personal and more scientifically ethnographic observations of English culture. Examples of epistolary reverse ethnographies include Oliver Goldsmith's The Citizen of the World, Elizabeth Hamilton's translation of the letters of a Hindu Raja, and the anonymously authored Woman of Color. Each features a traveler, the Chinese philosopher Lien Chiao-Tangi, the Indian prince Zarmilla, and the biracial Jamaican heiress Olivia Fairfield within the English landscape. While each traveler's motivations differ, they share a desire to know England more closely, having heard secondhand of its inhabitants' praiseworthy intellect, faith, and morality. In the ensuing letters home, the narrator's recollected encounters with the English fuel their cultural disillusionment as the author's satirical focus becomes increasingly evident. The works close with each narrator anticipating their return home, their British sojourns having fallen short of their expectations. While I could say much about the satirization of metropolitan England, I want to return and conclude with the question of form. Why use epistolary novels rather than fictionalized journals or travelogues for these reverse ethnographies? In fact, it isn't until 1810 that the first non-fictional reverse travelogue, The Travels of Mirza Abu Talib Khan, is translated posthumously into English from Persian. So these fictional reverse ethnographies on one level attempt to reveal aspects of English culture made visible from a peripheral perspective. Yet more intriguing is the epistolary novel's formal similarity with the letter book. As I mentioned earlier, the East India Company's governance was largely premised on and facilitated by the production and subsequent archiving of written documents created by British civil servants. But by the late 18th century, the East India Company archives had grown to encompass documents produced by Indian nationals. As Michael Fisher succinctly summarizes, British authorities and public opinion generally regarded the company as accountable for Indians, variously defined, both in distant India and more immediately in Britain. Parliament indeed determined that the company ultimately bore legal as well as moral responsibility for indigent Indians in Britain. The company's directors generally recognized these obligations, usually motivated by their desire to remove Indians from British public discourse and back to India. Further, in the service of colonial control, the company's growing colonial archive amassed vast statistical and descriptive evidence about India and Indians. These extensive acquisition policies preserved the words of Indians in Britain through their many original letters, petitions, narratives, bonds, and other self-representations. So while the East India Company was collecting and archiving letters and letter books from Indian nationals to British civil servants, the epistolary novels demonstrate the potential for a transgressive archive that defies containment within the official East India Company archive. While the content of these reverse ethnographies may variously condone and condemn colonialism, the imagined letters themselves are physically transgressive. Rather than being contained within these archives, the letters, albeit fictional, cross national borders with impunity. All three ethnographies conclude with letters that destabilize any assumptions of British cultural superiority, a message that the fictional traveler intends on sharing upon their return home. These epistolary novels then give voice to countercultural perspectives, despite and perhaps even in defiance of the East India Company's attempts to collect, contain, and conceal such correspondence away from public consumption.
Thank you so much. If our panelists don't mind joining us up here, we're transitioning to our Q&A portion for the day. So give them a minute to get settled. Everyone's got their water. Thank you so much for our world tour that we just went on. And I would like to open up questions from our audience.
I thought that was fabulous. I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much to all three presenters. And then one of the sort of themes I saw kind of emerging was this kind of difference between public and private writing, and writing privately and writing to a kind of a public audience. And I just wondered if each of you could sort of say a little bit more about that. And so Olivera, I thought it was so interesting when you said that they were having difficulties getting people to write, right? This fear about how people would be, how the letters would be read. And is that because they were writing to a large kind of public audience, not a specific person, do you think? Or
I write about this in the article quoted. They were asked by John Bruce, a Scottish man who was working for the East India Company, like many other Scots, as his name was, his title was the official historiographer of the East India Company. There were people with that job, and so he was given the job on the eve of the renewal of the charter to compile books of history of the company activities in the East Indies that would demonstrate that the company deserves the renewal. And so rather than sort of speculate, or this was around 1790, rather than sort of ride on the bad publicity of the Warren Hastings trial, he was sort of instructed to write to various people in India, including Macartney, and to ask them to command their servants to write letters in which they would provide the evidence of experience of how things really are. And he waits and waits, and people just aren't writing. And then he has the nephew of Henry Dundas, who in sort of popular culture was nicknamed Henry IX, because he exerted a huge power over all sorts of things. And he was very interestingly, in my opinion, in the late 18th century, the home minister. The home minister is something like Minister of Police and Internal Affairs. Suddenly India is the purview of that minister. And Henry Dundas sort of suggests to his nephew, who is a writer in India, to help John Bruce. And so there's like a whole exchange between the two of them, in which the young, I think David was his first name, Bruce is writing to, David Dundas is writing to John Bruce, kind of like, I'm really trying, but nobody wants to talk to me. And he talks about how people are keeping secrets, how people have their own private business going, how nobody wants to write, especially not about what they're actually doing and what success is underway, because they have no idea who's going to end up reading this, and they don't know John Bruce. So they don't know who he owes favors and what he's going to do with whatever is going to be looking like actual testimony of anything. So it's kind of a great, I think, discussion in the archival framework about what one could supply.
We talk about gaps in the archive, and it's so interesting to think about letters that never existed, right? And then how do we sort of interpret that silence? I don't want to dominate, but I thought it was so interesting because it kind of picks up with the letter that you talked about from S.L. Simmons, who's writing to his sister, so it's another private letter, and then doesn't mention the revolt, right? And so to have that kind of silence too, I thought was super interesting.
I think because of the collecting missions of the places I've worked, I've read very, very few what I would call like truly private letters. Most of the correspondence I've read have been from the beginning, like kind of official reporting governmental things. And I've narrowed my focus because like you could spend your lifetime reading that, especially at the National Archive in Kew, right? Like you could spend a lifetime reading that. So I think I focused my attention on the letters that are around the time that I knew revolts were happening to see if I could like read snippets of those revolts being described and discussed. But in terms of private writing, I'm thinking immediately of Maria Nugent's journal. She is married to a governor of Jamaica, and she is in Jamaica around the time that the Haitian Revolution is happening. And so she writes this journal, and it's like, so Haitian Revolution, like 1790s to like 1804, I think. And I think she's in Jamaica 1801 to maybe 1804 or 3. Somebody can Google it right now if you want to, but I guess I could too. But so in her journal, it's like typical of that time period. It's like, oh, I never meant to publish this, and my children can when I'm dead, right? I really think it's so like literarily written, and it seems self-conscious of itself. This is what we do as literary critics. Like, of course she wanted to publish it. I wanted to read it. But anyway, I guess the short version is like I see it, because of the places I have done work, because of their collecting missions, I haven't seen a lot of the private correspondence that I think a lot of us in this room like do work on. Mine from the get-go has been like governmental, like legally minded.
That's one more quickly. And then Jennifer, I thought it was so interesting when you talked about this epistolary novel, right? And the role that it's playing. And how do you, I mean, obviously, it's just in lots of ways, it's a kind of false binary, right? To talk about kind of private and public, because we know like lots of private letters were circulated widely, especially when they had sort of travel information. But how would you sit the epistolary novel within sort of those ideas about the public and the private, given it's a public document, obviously, but often it's narrating kind of private relationships?
Well, I think one thing that I was thinking about in connecting the epistolary novel back to the letter books is thinking about how there are different publics and there are different levels of privacy. So and I'll get back to the epistolary novel, I have an answer here, but with the letter books, there is an expectation when McCartney is constructing those, or because some of them are in his hand and some of them are in a secretary's hand. And when he is constructing those letter books, there is a sense of, yes, somebody else beside me could consult these, but not the general public. Like these are other officials who will, so it's public, but it's a limited public. The journal, he had no problem passing that around. I mean, he would restrict people and say, oh, please don't cite more than this amount in what you're writing. But I mean, it is just widely cited in all of the travel narratives. So it's just a kind of free-for-all with McCartney's journal. And yet the journal reads as something that he didn't intend to be public. It reads as very much like, oh, I kind of had this curious thing happen to me and this, and haha, isn't this funny? And it's just a completely different tone. You were talking about this morning with Gaskell, the various me's. McCartney has so many different me's really in there. And so with the epistolary novels, I think that they are writing them to be between these two spaces, to kind of think about something that, well, yes, if I am sending this, it's going through this public kind of, I'm sending a letter in the mail. there is always that chance that it's intercepted, someone opens it, someone reads it, and it's also crossing national borders, so who knows what's going to happen with that letter.
The ship could sink.
Exactly, yeah, it might completely just evaporate. And so you've got this, and so I think that the epistolary novel is neatly situated between these two. I know.
Yes.
I have a big question, I think, and I'm just going to throw it at you because I can't figure it out myself. So I thought I'd give it to you to figure it out. Picking up what you said, Olivera, on the archive of empire, but also connecting it to this idea of the Republic of Letters, culture of correspondences. We can agree, I think, that any archive of empire is full of absences and deletions and silences and inferences as well, because you assume that someone talks, let's say, about an enslaved person, that this is what it was, and we don't know. Or you hear of formerly enslaved people who had patrons, Sancho and Wheatley. They wouldn't have published without patrons, right? So, but it also assumes that, and I think what you mentioned about the Indian letters of petition, that is always, we always come back to this culture of correspondence, that the letter is the vehicle to communicate. What I can't figure out is, because I just don't know, is did China have a traditional culture of correspondence before it linked up with Britain? What was the kind of communication? Because we are so zooming into the letter form, the different, you know, letter writing manuals, and what petition letters look like, the letter books, blah, 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 all of that. But I want to know, well, if we have an archive of empire, wouldn't that just be one-sided? And not only because you don't have the enslaved people, the laboring poor, but you also don't know what the other cultures used as a. Yeah. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
That's your question now. There we are.
Gonna say a brief thing. It absolutely makes sense, and that's why I said at the very beginning, we're only talking about from the kind of presentation that we have received, and even that we've tried, but it's very, very limited. So for instance, on the topic of the history of South Asia and how it gets treated through on our end of things, there's until maybe 10 years ago, there was a huge problem, for instance, with sort of decolonial readings of colonial archives, because a lot of people who studied that history did not read Persian. A lot of documentation in South Asia before the arrival of the British was in Persian, and so a bunch of stuff that was there, but nobody knew how to use it. Especially not in a way, not in any of the languages that people here know how to read. But there has been interesting history, for instance, Bhavani Raman. This is all work by historians who sort of are more invested in writing histories of empire from the post-colonial perspective. The book is called The Document Raj, and talks about how the sort of invasion of the British governance was an invasion of certain protocols of literacy and documentation. So the status of signature, the status of petition, completely change sort of how people on the ground address government. And there's a whole sort of culture of petitioning and local sort of literate people who, I don't know, sit under the tree and receive clients for whom they write letters to the government petitioning for all sorts of things. And a lot of these sort of roles were perceived by the colonial government as sort of traditional caste distinctions, ethnic groups, and so on. So a lot of present day nationalism, let's say, is directly related to how the East India Company kind of designed roles for everyone. And similarly, Sir William Jones, people have probably heard of him, the guy who came up with the idea that the Indo-European family of languages is a thing. Fascinating story. He was an officer, or he was a judge of the Supreme Court in Calcutta for the East India Company. He kind of mobilized a whole bunch of people, all the dudes who were working for the East India Company, whose purpose in the late 18th century was to sort of rule the indigenous people by their own traditions and laws. So he mobilized this whole effort to learn the languages so that they could interpret the texts that are sort of legal provisions for the local populations. He basically declared all kinds of texts that could have been religious texts, that could have been epics, that could have been any number of things, including like dramatic monologues. Those were now laws, and the state kind of took over and used those texts, interpreted those as legal provisions that regulate the interactions of local communities. Not much we can do about it now, but it's kind of like the categorizations that leak into whatever we can know now.
One of the really interesting things about Britain's interaction with China is their failure to understand that they were dealing with another empire, that this was an inter-imperial relationship. And they treated them as a country rather than an empire. And so what you ask about, was there a kind of culture of correspondence in China? Oh, they did it so much better than the East India Company. I mean, letters upon letters that would be petitions to the imperial court, or letters that the imperial court would then send as kind of missives more to send messages about proclamations or new laws and things like that. Letters that were sent back with the embassy that were directed to George III and were never translated until the beginning of the 20th century. So you've got weird things like that happening. But very much dependent on kind of this and things that they secreted away. They did not allow the British to have access to this. So the British, when they were particularly, so most of the time they're in Canton, they're restricted there until after the First Opium War, and then they gain a little bit more ground. But prior to the First Opium War, they're in Canton. It is illegal for Chinese citizens to teach foreigners Chinese. And so they are learning Chinese secretly. And then when they can't get a hold of books, it's whatever they manage to get a hold of. But people are secretive. They're not, and even when the government is like, sure, you can have this book, it's like a book of poetry from 400 years ago. So they develop this very weird perception of what Chinese literature looks like. But they're like, for example, the Chinese novel is developing in the 18th century at the same time as the English novel. And yet there is one mention, there's all of this sinology that's being published in the early 19th century. There is one reference to this text anywhere. And that is a text that it's known variously as The Dream of Red Mansions or The Story of the Stone. And this is something that also has letters incorporated into the text. It has poetry incorporated into the text. So there is this vast body of material. And in a way, I think that is what makes China for some time somewhat kind of immune to British incursions, because they do have a system set up and a canal system. I mean, just so elaborate in the formation of the Qing Empire that, yeah, it's there.
I appreciate that question, and I think part of the answer demands looping in our archival studies colleagues too, because it's collecting practices. So like to be able to talk about an archive of empire, like, because we know archives are also structures, not just collections of records. So like if I go to the National Archive in Kew, like their collecting practices have made it what it is. So like what I can expect to find there. And I love your reference of, you know, like Sancho and Wheatley. And so like, if I'm thinking of Wheatley's collection of poetry in terms of provenance, we have the Bostonian leading men who endorse it, and they're a part of the provenance of that document. But if folks in the room know Honoré Fanon Jeffers' Age of Phyllis, you know, like that text, it's critical fabulation. It imagines other poems, either like written to or written by like a Phyllis Wheatley Peters-esque persona. Phyllis Wheatley Peters' parents are not part of the provenance of her collected works, right? So I don't know, I think collecting practices, even just like publication trends, those things have so seeped into how we even think about texts as these discrete discrete documents in and of themselves. But thank you for asking us that question. I think it was really important.
I think if I could just add half a sentence, because I also work for a big digital project, so we had precisely that. So you go from collections then to digitizing. And we had a wonderful student who might be listening in from Holland, not, I don't know, who was looking for slave narratives in that collection. So it's electronic enlightenment. And she had real problems trying to actually find references, because sometimes enslavement meant something very different. So suddenly you have these big digital projects and you think, well, how do you figure out the silences there, and who decides what to digitize? So you not only have who decides to collect and then what do we read, but then what is made available digitally, if that's a word. Is that a word?
Yes.
Now it is. So that's something we need to reflect on as well. And that there has been some work done on slow data and stuff so that you kind of work through digital editions, but you go back to the original text, I guess what you suggested as well. A lot of work to do.
Is there any? Okay.
Thank you, all three of you. It was fascinating and it's wonderful to learn from you. Rebecca, because you've mentioned archives so much, and this is to dovetail off her last comment. Have you actually read the collecting practices of these archives that you've gone to and asked for their collection?
That's a really good question. I feel like because it's my way to make friends with the staff at the places I go to. Like to the point I'm even like, can we get dinner tonight? Like that's who I am. Because like they do so much for me. I don't know if that's creepy, but that's what I am. You know, like how you feel about this place and this work. Do I make it a formalized method? No, but I think I'm going to now.
Especially because of what she said, I'm
Right.
wondering, are your places documenting their digitization protocols? Not what they do, but why are you making the decisions that you're making to digitize what you're doing? And if we're not, as institutions, we need to reflect and write that, because they're going to ask, why didn't you digitize X, Y, and Z? And then you're gonna be in trouble, right?
Well, and that's true. So if you go into all of the tons of databases that Adam Matthew has done, they usually do have a good description of, here are the things that are within this archive, and these are the things we've digitized. But sometimes what's missing is the why. Why these particular, why this body of texts? And so it's a fascinating thing to look at those kinds of descriptions, but often they're missing that why component.
And so if you're in a position to start thinking about that and instituting it, I would advocate that you do.
I'm gonna be chewing on your question for a really long time, so I appreciate that. One kind of answer maybe that occurs to me is I've noticed differences between like so-called like archives in the so-called underdeveloped world. So like archives across Jamaica, the resources are not what they are at like the Beinecke, for example. And so I think sometimes like I know someone who knows the person who was behind the massive digitization project of the UWI campus in Barbados. They had newspapers that they digitized. Amalia Levy is basically the lead person, if you recognize her name. So I know someone, I don't know her personally, I know someone who knows her, but to hear the story about the sort of like sheer panic that was behind part of that choice to digitize these things, and the horror of all the things that couldn't be digitized, but because of the limited resources, they had the ability to digitize something. And it was kind of like, oh my God, what do we pick? We can't do everything. We have to do something. And I think that crisis is more of a crisis in like more underfunded places, which tend to be outside of the US and Britain.
And it's also here in the US, but what I'm positing to you all to think about and to encourage others is to document why you're selecting what you're digitizing, so that when people start saying, what about this silence, you have a reason as to why you made the choices you made, and it's not arbitrary. Right? You have limited funds. You'll never digitize everything in the world, ever, no matter how said you think you are.
One place I worked at, their policy, I don't even know if this was like formalized, but it's just what they had been doing. Whenever somebody asked for something to be digitized for their own research, that's when it got digitized. It's because someone came to use it, so like now it's saved.
Yeah, it's like demand.
Uh-huh.
And then you have the problem that I think only about half of material in archives is catalogued, right?
Yeah.
So the remote person can't find it because it's not on the catalogue and
Mhm.
it's not going to get digitized, right? And so how you sort of deal with the metadata silences, right, as well as the other kinds of silence.
The reason they're often quite banal, aren't they? As you
Yeah.
say,
Yeah.
it's like who ordered some copies or are there funds or not? So, but you're right, one should somehow, even the banality needs to be addressed. As in we had no money.
Or even the things that get like lost. There's a word, there's an archival studies word for that. I'm not
De-accession.
Deaccession, thank you.
Or the things that we just decided as they came into us, we were not going to accession. It's part of archival collections at times. That also happens.
And but that's not generally, as far as I know, is not documented.
No, because we're trying to create less documentation whenever, like, you get 50 boxes from so-and-so's archives, that also includes one box of their, like, collection of Coca-Cola. Okay, we don't need to keep that because no one here is going to come looking for that particular thing. And so just sort of making those sorts of decisions. And so those kinds of things might, depending upon where you are, might not end up in the final version of the collection because, okay, no, this has nothing to do with any of the rest of it and it's not going to be because the person processing or preparing doesn't see the research value.
Yeah,
Which is a huge.
Conceptual question about what gets sort of how we describe the priorities, what keywords are used, what the theoretical discussions about historiography and methods of archiving are saying, but also, and this is particularly, I think, relevant to the archives of the East India Company. They've been in the process of being digitized, and what's going to happen inevitably, like it's happened with many 18th century collections, it's a private project. Corporation is doing this and it's going to be privatized. So it's not like access is going to improve. They are going to charge for access and to people who already are having trouble getting to it.
Mention Adam Matthew, that's Adam Matthew's expenses.
Really expensive.
Hugely, my institution can afford it.
Yes.
Comment from the Zoom. Sarah Haslam says, such an important point, but money is running out everywhere and archiving decisions can so easily become more politicized.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
That's nothing new,
All
though.
the time.
Yes. That is a constant struggle for all of us. Yes. And so are there any other questions, comments? Then 4:50, but I do have some closing announcements. So I do want to make sure I get those out to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you once again for our panelists.